Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of comics like Something is Killing the Children, World Tree, The Department of Truth, The Deviant, Spectrograph, Blue Book, and the upcoming The Nice House by the Sea. It's James Tynion IV. Thanks for coming on, James.
Hey, it's really good to be chatting with you. We were doing this once a month for a full year. I've missed you.
I feel out of practice. It's been like 6 months since we talked every month for an entire year. It is very strange. I do think it's funny how quickly we fell into our original cadences, though, because we talk so much. But before we even started recording, we were just talking about musicals, and Stephen Sondheim came up. And I was talking about how, you know, you said Sweeney Todd. Sweeney Todd is like basically him challenging himself to do a horror musical. Like, how can it be done? And you were like, that's actually an inspiration. Like, how do I push myself in the same way? So I want to talk about Sondheim for a second. How is Sondheim an inspiration for you in some ways?
I mean, I think Stephen Sondheim is the greatest composer and lyricist like in Broadway history. And I think part of it is that he was always trying to make musicals out of things that shouldn't work as a musical. And he was trying to capture an idea. And, you know, when he started with working on a bunch of like much more typical projects, like A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, it's a musical comedy. And it is just a fun little musical comedy. And then he like did the lyrics for West Side Story, which was like very new and innovative at the time, but it was still like, it was a piece in and of itself. And he sort of like pulled all these pieces together, and then he just kept challenging himself over and over and over again. And I think part of it actually goes back to like him as a little kid, or not a kid, but as a teenager. His family would vacation in the same place that Oscar Hammerstein, like Rodgers and Hammerstein, would. And so this young little kid playing the piano would like go and chat with one of the composers of, you know, Sound of Music, like The King and I, like the biggest musicals of all time at that point. And Hammerstein would give him these little challenges that he would have to sort of think his way out of. And there's an original set of challenges, and I'm going to get it wrong, but he basically like challenged Sondheim to write like 3 musicals to teach himself how to like write musicals. And it was like adapt one from a play, adapt one from a book, and adapt something from like that you wouldn't think to adapt like a musical from. And it was just like, and I'm definitely getting those wrong, but it started with this kind of challenge of just like, how do you take something and reinvent it? And then I love musical theater because it just like, it cuts directly to an emotional core of a thing. Like, honestly, I connected a lot to like, I always connected it a lot to like writing comics that are like very action driven, because it's like action beats in comics serve the same thing as a musical number. They're like, it's the flashy thing that happens that's like kind of built into the medium that is there, but the goal of it is to express character. Like, obviously, like action moves plot forward, but it is like, you know, in a superhero comic, the action scene is what defines the central essence of a character and like what their strengths and weaknesses are, which is how we talk about them emotionally. I have lots of thoughts about this. We don't have to spend an hour talking about musical theater, but I could.
So listeners don't know this, but one time on Sketched, I don't remember how it came up. I think somebody was like asking me for comps of characters to varying different comic book creators. And I comped you to Prometheus, the DC villain. And you actually like that. You specifically told me that you like that. The reason why I brought it up is because you're so good at like finding specific characteristics of specific comic creators and kind of learning from them and saying, how can I put this tool into my toolbox? And it's funny because like we comic fans have a tendency of being a little myopic where we think very single comics. That's the only place you can take from. But that's the thing I think is interesting is you can learn from anyone, and you can learn from those specific things that Sondheim did, or I don't know, I'm just going to throw out random names like David Fincher, or because like Deviant, that's got a little Fincher in it and everything like that.
I would say more than a little.
More than a little. So there's all these different people that you could be like not taking from, but learning from. And I think that's one of your great gifts is the fact that it's like you're not trying to homage these people. You're not trying to steal from them. You're trying to say, how can I take this bit and turn it into my own thing?
Yeah, you know, especially in creator-owned work, the work is always designed to express, like, I'm always trying to express something personal. And, you know, we've talked a lot in the past about how I kind of start with the vibes of a thing. And so I'm always trying to tap into the sort of central vibes of like what I want to talk about, and like, and what are the things that have made me feel like the kind of feeling I am trying to create in my reader, and then also trying to unpack why it made me feel that, and all of that. So I always go back to, the cultural touchstones that made me, and and a lot of them are still superhero comics. I'm talking to you in front of a wall of that I would say is still 50%, if not more, superhero comics. But there's the full breadth of the comics medium. There's manga, there's like indie alternative comics, there's creator-owned work through the direct market. But then beyond that, it's just novels. It's nonfiction, it's like podcast, it's music. I've talked a lot in the past about how I think one of the traps we fall into in geek media, we can get very myopic. We kind of just talk about ourselves and we just talk about nostalgia. And nostalgia can be such a poison to creativity, because really what you're saying at the end of the day is, I really loved reading this comic when I was 13.
Right.
Every good comic creator has a great story in them that taps into, I really loved reading this story when I was 13. But once you tell that story, then what else do you have to say? What else are you trying to tap into? And if you're just pulling from the same sphere of references, you're just going to start telling like lesser versions, or more convoluted versions of the same thing over and over, rather than trying to find like the real core root ideas and core root feelings that about the world, about yourself, that you're actually interested in talking.
We're recording this on Friday, June 14th. I'd have to contextualize, because when I was going to say that Something is Killing the Children #0 is announced this week, it would be like if somebody listened to it and they didn't have that frame of reference, they'd be like, what the hell? But I think that's interesting that you're saying that when that book was announced, because when I was a kid and when a Zero book was announced, like I remember when Zero Hour happened and there was all these Zero books, I was just like, oh my God, this is like amazing. And then it became a thing, and it became a thing, it became a thing, and it became an overdone thing. And the interesting thing is those went away. And when that was announced, there was this thing in my head that said, I wonder if James is trying to like reclaim the power of a Zero issue, because I think that there's a version of I think nostalgia, what you're saying is true. You can't just be nostalgia, but I think that there's power in something that used to be done if you can find a new way to do it. And that was an interesting announcement, because it did make me think, I wonder if James figured out a way to do a Zero issue and not make it cheap.
Well, I hope so.
TBD.
Yeah, TBD. We're working on it. I think you hit the nail on the head. There's power in the old forms, and there's power in especially like direct market single issue comics. There were lots of patterns in which we've released these before and all of that. And there's also a shorthand of language. Like what a Zero issue says is that this is a standalone story that unpacks some element of the mythology, but also operates as a kind of stepping on point. It's a step back. It's an aerial view. And so when we were talking about what we could do for the 5th anniversary of Something is Killing the Children, there were a bunch of options on the table, and there are a few of them that we are going to do, but further down the road, we weren't able to get them up and going in time for September, or at least not in a way that they would have been done well. Really, the thing that it came down to is there is a very simple story that when I would go into meetings talking about the TV adaptation of Something is Killing the Children, people would ask me about that opening sequence with Erica Slaughter, her coming out of the woods for the first time, and you see the end of a case. And it's just by planting that little seed of an end of a case, it creates the question of what that case was. And it's just and then what about that first story arc of that full first story cycle of Something is Killing the Children is that it ends with Erica leaving the House of Slaughter. So it's just where was she emotionally heading into that story, and who was that little girl? What's the story there? And then what does that say about the larger mythology, and what seeds can that question plant for the future of the mythology? And so that created those questions created a platform for me to answer them, especially because now I'm existing in a space where we have spin-offs of Something is Killing the Children. We're talking about adaptations in multiple media and all of this shit. I don't want somebody else to answer that question. I want to answer that question.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that is the sort of central drive of it.
There's not much you can say about those rooms themselves, but do you find that when you're in those rooms where you're talking about like TV adaptations and things like that, that the people in that space or in spaces outside of comics think about your work in a completely different way than you did or maybe your peers do?
It's a different math. Every medium comes with a different math, and I think that a lot of my stories are long form, so I have lots of conversations about television, and with television, it's all about character. And so the trap that we fall into, that like works against how I tend to write, is that a television writer wants to know the full long form story of Erica Slaughter. I'm always the one trying to sort of pull back on that and trying to be like, no, there's a mystery to Erica. The main character is the kid in the town. Like, there in an Erica Slaughter novel, there is a kid in a town who is starting to unravel this whole larger mystery of the fact that monsters exist and all of that. And then this bizarre figure enters the scene. And Erica's the bizarre figure. Like I've been reading a lot of Agatha Christie lately, and I keep saying it's like Erica is like Hercule Poirot. Like, when Poirot enters a story, he's not suddenly the main character of the story, but he's not the protagonist of the story, but he's the central figure. Like, and he's the crucial central figure. And you get pieces of his emotionality and all of this stuff. But, someone who has spent years in the TV minds, it is like, it's an entirely different way of thinking. And it's just like, and it's fascinating. And then honestly, like, I take a lot from it too, because you see these characters from a different perspective, and you see, like, I've laid out all of these little, points on like a plot chart, and then you see someone draw a completely different image out of them, and then you're like, oh wow, I need to fill in more of this area over here, because otherwise they're going to go off in a totally different direction. But I want to do that and stay true to the character that I write in the books. It's all managing it different, and it's like, and once again, it's like I am very concerned with the central vibes of the thing. When I'm working with people who are adapting my work, it is like, what I always say is that what matters to me is the essence of the thing. An adaptation of Something is Killing the Children needs to be about the same things that Something is Killing the Children is about. But I don't like one-to-one adaptations. I think you need to kind of strip everything down to its bare essence and then rebuild it for the medium. And there are the processes that I've been more directly a part of. With the iterations of Something is Killing the Children, I'm a kind of guiding force. I'm able to, I'm giving notes, I'm giving my opinions and stuff like that. With Department of Truth, I can't talk much about that adaptation, though I hope to be able to say a few more things about it sooner rather than later. I've been much more a driving force in those conversations with a few other people, and there it's much more so. It's just like the way some Department of Truth is written. It's a kind of Alice narrative. It's Cole Turner going down the rabbit hole. And that's very deliberate, but it's also one of those things that works against television, because that makes him a very passive protagonist. And it works in comics when we're doing these one-shot issues that are dealing with all of these like big esoteric concepts. But like in television, there needs to be a more like central driving mechanism. And so like solving that problem was one of the things that we spent the most time, and I think we did. But it's also about like, what's the essence of the thing we are trying to make, and then who are we making it for? Like, those are always the questions that I'm asking myself.
The reason why I brought it up is your comment about Erica coming out after the case and like kind of wondering like what was before. It reminded me of something I think it was Brian Michael Bendis told me about his experience on Powers, where they were like, how did everybody get the powers? And he was like, who cares? It doesn't matter. It's interesting how sometimes those things that don't seem like a big deal to you at all, where it's just like, what difference does it make how they got the powers? The thing that matters is they got the powers, can be a massive deal to somebody in a different field or just another person. And those things can completely shift the conversation, I imagine.
Absolutely. And then once again, it was the realization of some of that stuff in the earliest conversations about adapting Something is Killing Children to other media, which is the reason why I started these series of one shots we've been doing every winter of like the Book of Slaughter, Book of Butcher, and there'll be a third one this year, shocker. But I mean, like, there are these text portions of those one shots that deal with the larger mythology. And the first one deals very specifically with, like, what is the process of being a member of the Order of St. George? And, like, what are the initiation moments and all of this stuff, which I had just hinted at. And I had some of it filled out in my head, and some of it I was leaving loose to, like, But it was just like, oh, if I don't fill this in, they're going to make up their own answers. And it's just like, and if they make up their own answers, that can be fine, but they need to know what my intention is.
Right.
And I need to lay out what the intention is in the series. So I started to like, okay, I'm going to nail it all down. And then in the second one, we're dealing with like the nature of monsters and how monsters work, which is the other big question that they have. It's like, literally, it's like, okay, a child's fear forms into a monster. They're like, how? And I'm just like, don't worry about it. Like, that's like that, like everyone understands that if you say that, like, in a line of dialogue, like the nature of like the metaphysical like reality of that formation matters so much less than the fact that the monster is formed by a child's fears. But that can be a real stumbling block for like an executive or for a writer. So it's just like, okay, now there's an answer. You realize the blanks that you need to fill in and when you need to fill them in. And then it's being strategic about when to fill those in. In the process of that, you also learn as a creator, what are the things that you are absolutely firm on, and what are the things that are just like, oh yeah, you can like, do your own version of this. That doesn't really matter.
I'm with you on the adaptations thing because I feel like I've always said that adaptations should capture the spirit of the thing, not the exact plot. Because if you're just doing the exact plot, why don't you just read the comic or the book or whatever? But this all does bring up a big question I had in my mind when I was thinking about when we were considering doing this podcast. I'm just going to do a quick rundown. So you're doing TV stuff, obviously. You launched a new company, the new Tiny Onion. You just went through a giant Kickstarter with Boom for celebrating a decade of James Tynion at Boom Studios. You have clearly plenty of comics coming based on my intro. Here's the loaded question. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
I'm doing great, honestly.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. But I mean, like, I've always been doing a lot. There's a degree to which I don't know if I'm capable of like doing less. I'll find that out someday. But right now, sort of like anytime I give myself time off, I end up coming up with new ideas and then I want to start pursuing them. But there were a lot of things I was worried about, especially in the building of the new company, that like over the last year I've been very vigilant about like going to the gym a certain number of times a week and staying on top of scripts, which is like essentially now there's a part of my day that is James the writer, and then there's part of my day that's James the CEO. And both of those are very important parts of my day. And then on top of that, it's not that I don't like, I actually really enjoy all the business stuff. Like, and I'm learning more and more that I have a disposition toward it. And so it's like, I want to do all of these things, but I also want to have a social life. I want to be able to hang out with people on the weekends during the summer, like, God forbid. And so balancing all of it's difficult. Like, it's absolutely difficult. And every week I have to make compromises in one corner or the other. But I try to sometimes, like, make sure that I'm making the compromises that lean toward James the human being, not just James the business. It's all balance. It's a long-term balancing act. And like, this is what I signed up for. I knew in starting my own business that the next few years of my life would be the most intense work-wise of probably my entire life. And if I build it all correctly, then I can kind of like step back and sort of watch the machine that I built and then step in, where I'm most excited on both a business and a creative front. But right now I kind of have to do a little bit of everything, especially as I build it, because, if I don't, then that creates the room for somebody else to like step in and do it for me. And I've learned over and over and over that it's like, I do have a vision for what I'm building and I have a plan. And I want to enact the pieces of the plan. And then once they're enacted, then I can be like, okay, hey, like, now you oversee this, but I gotta get it all up and running.
Do you have business cards that say CEO?
Oh, I absolutely do. But yeah.
If you're going to San Diego, I want one of those. I think that's awesome.
Absolutely. They're really cool too. I'm trying to see if I have, well, this is a podcast, so I can't, it's not useful.
Yeah.
Pull one up, but after we're done, I'll go like off to a corner and I'll pull one out and show it to you.
That sounds good. And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Looking for the right place to read digital comics? You can find it at Omnibus. Omnibus is a modern digital comic book store and reader app carrying your favorite single issues, volumes, and omnibuses all day and date. It's just like a comic book shop where you pay per book, but digital. And the team at Omnibus has massive news. It's now available everywhere, including iPads, iPhones, Android devices, and its web reader. However you want to read comics, you can find it on Omnibus and all in your pocket. Looking for an ideal digital comic book store with an excellent shopping and reading experience? One that uses novel discovery features that helps fans find their next new favorite book, and one that features many of the best publishers, including Image, Boom, Dark Horse, and more? You can find it all on Omnibus at omnibus.app. And now, back to the show. I hate to do this. This is terrible to do, but one of the funny things about us doing that entire year interview series is like, I kind of feel like people to some degree started thinking I was like a representative of you. And so when Tiny Onion was announced, the company, Tiny Onion, your new company with Jaslyn Stone as director of marketing, with Eric Harburn as director of editorial, and then Courtney Menard as director of production? Yes. Yeah. So with that as the team plus 4 other team members, you have this whole company that's dedicated to a whole lot of things. And I had so many people ask me, like, can you explain this to me? And I'm like, you got to reach out to Jaslyn, man. This is not my job. So I'm going to cede the floor to you because this is your baby. Would you mind, from your perspective, explaining what the new Tiny Onion is? And if I was a creator, what should be appealing about working with your team over there? Because I feel like I owe the people who ask me answers.
Yeah. No, and I mean, I think it's a fair question. Like, we've been chatting for enough years, like beyond, like, and not just the year where we talked every single month. That, I think that I like people being like, what the fuck is he up to?
Yes, and you succeeded, my friend. You succeeded.
I relish that immensely. And, really what Tiny Onion is it's a few things. Top level. On one hand, Tiny Onion is now the business entity that manages my intellectual property in Hollywood and other media. So it's just like that allows me to drive, central conversations about adapting my work like into films, into television, into animation. People are going to start seeing those announcements start rolling out over the next few months because we have a lot of really interesting things moving and I have a lot of ambitions in that lane. But I didn't build this company just to be my stepping stone into other media. It's always been a bit more about centering my vision of how I see comics could work and trying to make that happen. I needed to build this managerial system around myself because I'm a high output writer that works at a bunch of different publishers that all work slightly differently. And so I had to build this myself. Like, this is there to function at the, like, well, at a certain level. Like, I need multiple editors. I need different people who can put out different fires at different moments. And there are little things that I learned very early on in working at each of these companies that it's just like, I have, there are specific elements of this, like in terms of a design approach, in terms of like a creative approach, and in terms of like how I want to tell these stories and how I want to release these stories. I have all of that. I'm not looking to a publisher to do that. But each publisher has a kind of different feeling and vibe. So it's just like operating as basically an independent production company in the comic space is a kind of new idea, but that's essentially what we are. We are building in the way that like an independent film production company, like, will find the financing for a film, make the movie, make it as good as it can be, cast it, like put the whole package together, and then they take it out to the distributors. And the distributors are the ones that put them into movie theaters. And so right now, that is like at the core essence of Tiny Onion. That's what we're doing, but we're doing it in comics. So I have publishing partnerships, obviously, with Image, with Dark Horse, with Distillery. And then, I have my personal relationships with Boom Studios and with DC Comics. And it's just sort of, it's like, okay, we are building these books. We're figuring out what we think is going to do best in the market. And then we're going to the publishing partners that we feel like these are the books that best complement the books that we're already doing in each of these lanes. And then like we're providing our services for them and we're making sure that they're done to the caliber of my work. And right now, like the core of what we're doing is still very much centered on my work. But that gets us into the next tier of it, which is also the fact that like I built an independent editorial team and independent like production team and independent marketing team. And we are also a service that can be hired to provide those services.
Right.
The biggest example right now is you can see in every issue of Distillery, there's the credit packaged by Tiny Onion. So right now, Courtney Menard is running our production team and we're sending the Distillery books to the printer. on making sure that like all the files are the correct format and everything's going to print right and everything's going to print pretty. And the distillery books print very, very pretty. So it's important that that's an important job to get done.
I do want to emphasize really quick, you mean all distillery books, not just Spectrograph.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
All distillery books, the full line. And those are the sort of services that we're available for. So it's not like we are not in that kind of the mid-tier publisher lane where we are like, open accepting pitches that then like we finance for like half of the intellectual property and all of that. There are a handful of properties that I'm developing that I'm bringing on other creators for. There are creators that are working in our lanes. We see an opportunity to sort of position a book next to one of our titles. And so we're pulling in the people that are already kind of in the like Tiny Onion community to see what we can lean on there. And then other than that, there are other creators who have come to us to like hire us for our services. And then we sort of review those on a case by case basis. So we're doing a lot of stuff, but that's the heart of what we do.
Would you say that at its heart, Tiny Onion is a creator-centric company?
Yeah, I'm the creator.
Well, not just you, but I mean, like your services for like production and for marketing and for editorial. Those are things that a lot of people need that, I'm not going to name names, but like put them in a position where they take a deal they might not want to take because they need that sort of support. And so Tiny Onion, by offering those, can help allow people to go to places that might work out better for them. And it seems to me that you're kind of like the system that helps them avoid those things to some degree.
Yeah. Like I have a certain way of doing things and I'm particular. I have built a system that reflects me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there are creators who in personality or in like creative output are sort of aligned with how I view the industry and how I want to approach things. And so it's just like, I think they see an opportunity and like, okay, I want to take the benefit of like a system that is built that has some stability that, I can lean on to do the things that like are too exhausting to do myself, but otherwise might try to do myself. And that's really like, I think that's sort of what we're selling. But yeah. Like, the other thing is it's just like, this is, I'm not going to lie. The thing that I'm not trying to do is step forward and be like,
a publisher.
Like this is the James Tynion show. Like I'm not pretending that it's not. The company's called Tiny Onion. It's a version of my last name. The center of the business is going to be a lot of the like, big ideas that I'm trying to push. But that creates opportunities in an umbrella in which I am able to bring in interesting projects. And there are things like something I'm not going to talk much about, but let's say, for instance, if I wanted to completely rethink what Razor Blades could be, an independent horror anthology that I self-published with Steve Fox a few years ago. Now in a market with lots of horror anthologies, how can you do that in a new and interesting way that's a genuine experiment? And then who are the creators you can get to come play in that playground? And I think a lot of this is about creating interesting playgrounds where I can pull in the artists and writers that most fascinate me and who I love the most to come play.
Mm-hmm. I do think it's funny. This has been coming up way too often. It's like at this point, it kind of feels like I'm shoehorning it in. But one of the things that I've been noticing of late is that there's almost like a micro line phenomenon going on in the direct market comics where it's like the things that are doing the best are cohesive small lines. There's like the Ultimate Universe, there's Intergiant Universe, there's Ghost Machine. And like, of course, there's a commonality there that two of those three things are enormously popular properties. And so they have that going for them. But I do think that there's something to the idea of having like Tiny Onion as that umbrella that you're talking about, where instead of just seeing Image in the corner or Boom in the corner or whatever in the corner, then all of a sudden, I don't know if Tiny Onion's going to be on the covers or anything like that. But if you look inside and you say like produced by or packaged by by Tiny Onion, or you see something that specifically references that, it becomes, it's like, I think we talked about this before. Maybe it was me and Courtney that talked about this. It kind of reminds me of like A24. It's like when you see A24 at the beginning of a trailer, you're like, this is going to be interesting at the very least. So maybe I'll check this out. So if you see Tiny Onion, it becomes its own micro line, even if it's not just your stuff. It can be other people's stuff, but it's like this has been stamped with your approval to some degree. And I could see that succeeding in the same micro line sort of way.
And I hope so. Like, I do think that that's the basic idea. It is the books that we're going to be put out are like, and the ones that we're sort of pulling into our ecosystem are books that it's a curated line, but it's a disparate line. And I do want, when people see the name Tiny Onion or the Tiny Onion logo, or even that little like image of the spirally onion symbol, like I want people to have a sense of what the priorities of that book are. Because like everything that we're pulling in right now follows the priorities that I try to center in my own work.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to shift gears a little bit and kind of talk about your books in specific. And I think one thing that's interesting about 2024 for you, and we talked about this in our interview series, is that this year is kind of a celebration and return of what came before. Like you had the decade Kickstarter that just finished with Boom. You have Department of Truth returning. You have the Nice House series returning, albeit with a different name. You have returns. You have all these books that are like moving into different phases but still exist. One of the things that I'm interested in is like you've risen to a point where you're at a certain level. How do you maintain heat and momentum from all that? Do you think that there's a balance you have to have between your varying plans so you're always finding new things to build excitement in both your long-running titles and your new and upcoming ones? Because that's always the tough thing is it's like once you're on top, how do you stay there?
Well, and I think part of it is you have to start taking a long-term perspective. And I think some of the moves that, people will hear about Tiny Onion making over the next year are long-term perspective ideas. But the counter to all of that, and the reason why a year like this is really important, is follow through. And this isn't true of just comics. It's true of a lot of creative industries right now, especially, with everything so financialized and all of that. And, and I get it's like, it's a little hypocritical now that I have like a finance company, like to say that, but it's just like, we are in this moment where everything is built on potential. And, and then on top of that, it's taking the microcosm around like the speculator boom over the last few years and like what it's sort of shifting into now. But there's still like, things get a little buzzy and then it's like people are trying to buy in because they want to be a part of like, something big. The benefit of me is I've launched a few big things over the last few years. But the thing that happens over and over is like, I would say 1 out of 5 of those like big things like actually reaches its conclusion and like ends satisfactorily. And a bunch of things like just sort of peter off. Some of them don't even get to conclude in the way that like the creators intended and all that stuff. Or creators get pulled into other media and don't wrap up the properties. And it's just one of those things where if I am taking a long-term perspective about what matters about like, about what you can expect from a Tiny Onion book, it's like, I need to stick the land. And I have a bunch of like long form projects that are what my sales power is built on. The short-term goal is making sure that over the next few years that I make sure those books are coming out and make sure that they are damn good. Like I need to be working at the like, at the apex of my skill. And then like one by one, we'll bring each of them in for a landing as we set up like what the next things are. Because if I become a creator who just lets a bunch of books like trail off, that just sort of starts a bunch of things and never finishes them, then at a certain point, like how can a retailer convince a reader to start a new one of my series?
Yeah.
And in the meantime, I'm sort of shifting to like there's sort of two different models where it's just like obviously like now I have enough like product out there that it can kind of work for whatever your reading type is. Because I know there are lots of something. Obviously, Something is Killing the Children still has a lot of like monthly readers. But now, like I'm more and more and more, especially when I go to signings and stuff, I'm meeting the people who found it through the trades. And every time a new trade comes out and bookstores and comic shops across the country restock the entire run of Something is Killing the Children, an entire new batch of audience comes into that series. And now what I'm like providing retailers with is here's an entire shelf of James Tynion books. that you can like if they like this, then you can guide them towards one of those series. And it's trying to and identifying like, okay, like if you like this about something is killing the children, you are really going to like this book. If you like this about Nice House on the Lake, you're going to really like World Tree. Like those are the sorts of things that, I am trying to sort of lay out a map of basically how do you like as a retailer, like I want to make it very easy for retailers to keep all of my books in stock. Like that is my like primary goal because like the long-term value of me as a creator is the idea that it's just like the retailers being able to sell my books. And so it's just like that is why a return year like this is really important. And then it's like I still have like a series of new launches, like especially through Distillery, but those are short form miniseries. They're like prestige. I'm bringing in like big artists, like they're like these big blowups. And then once again, it'll end with like a beautiful book on the stands that it's just like, oh, you really like the human characters of Nice House. Here's a ghost story that like James did with Christian Ward. And then it's just like, and then they can upsell that book. And it's just like, it's wanting them to be able to do that. And then it's seeing if we can also do that for what we do in creators that we bring in around us. That's my evil plan.
That's a weird evil plan. Doesn't seem that evil, James. We talked about this before. I still think you need like the worlds of James Tynion like infographic that's printable for retailers or something like that, where it's just like, you like this stuff? Boom, here's a little handout that you can put in with every purchase of your stuff. But it's funny. This reminds me of a bunch of different things. There's this old adage in sports. I don't remember. I think it's credited to the former New England Patriots head coach Bill Belichick, but I don't know if it's actually him. The line was, "The best ability is availability," in that it's like you could be like the best comic or player or whatever in the world, but if you're not there and you're not consistent, then you're not as useful as you should be. And it kind of reminds me of two things. It reminds me of The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead's secret superpower was that Charlie Adler is not human, and he would churned out an issue every single month forever for basically the totality of that run. So that book was constantly going at its peak of its powers. And it also reminds me of The Bear, the TV show, in that show's great. But I think part of the reason why it's managed to be as successful as it is every, I think, June, basically, there's a new season that hits. And you can run it like clockwork. And so people, like in a time where like a show that's great, like Severance, disappears for like 4 years, The Bear has got this like superpower behind it. And I think you're totally right. Like, being available, being in shops and reminding people that your books are there, like Department of Truth or Nice House and stuff like that. I think that's enormously valuable and kind of underrated sometimes. There's a balance there, of course. You want to make the best thing you can. You don't want to kill Alvaro and you don't want to kill Martin, but there is a balance.
Yeah. And I mean, like, and this is the real thing. It's being able to express like, roughly what our publishing plan is. I know, like, retailers have told me it's like the long hiatus, even though we were doing Dracula also at Image, but it's just like the long hiatus on Department of Truth, like freaked some people out. Thankfully, now Department of Truth is coming back this month. 2 shops, and I was extraordinarily relieved to see that we had basically no attrition, like with the almost 2 years off the stands. That was a huge relief, because I mean, like, I know Department of Truth is like next to Something Is Killing the Children is like it's my other juggernaut.
Really?
It's the book that when I go to a comic convention, the 2 books that I get the most copies brought up to me are Something Is Killing the Children and Department of Truth. So it's just like, at this point, more than any of my Batman stuff.
I would have bet Nice House would have been number 2, but that's interesting.
Nice House is absolutely up there. I think if I sign at a comic convention, it's going to be Something Is Killing the Children and Department of Truth. If I were to sign at a bookstore, Nice House would probably be in the number 1 slot.
If you're going to France, damn straight, it's number 1.
Yeah, if I'm in France, then it's like, actually, Department of Truth also does extremely well in France.
Oh, does it?
Yeah, everyone loves Martin's art. The words are fine.
I just want to give a quick shout out. I don't know if this is an atypical or an uncommon opinion. I think World Tree is my favorite book of yours.
I really appreciate that. It's always interesting to be at the moment that we're at with World Tree. Like, there's always buzz, like, right around the launch of a series. But then you kind of need a couple volumes to come out for people to start, like, okay, I'm invested in this, over and over and over again. And it's just World Tree has been building. And honestly, like one thing that was great is over the last 3 issues, like sales have been going up issue to issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means more people are finding it with the trade and more people are being like, I don't want to wait until volume 2 comes out. And like that's exactly what we want to see. And that's ultimately what we saw with Something is Killing the Children. It's just like we had a good show with number 1, and then something started building like during the second arc. And then it was like the third arc like launched bigger than issue 1 had launched at, and then, the fourth arc launched at twice the sales of that issue 1 launched at.
Wow.
And obviously, like, that was during a particular moment in the industry. But it's just like, those are the sorts of things that, I try to like lean into as much as I can.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. The crowdfunding platform Zoop is growing. For the 20th anniversary of the Eisner-nominated Hack Slash, they have unleashed the first ever Zoop Games project, transforming the comic into a deck-building card game. If you're a fan of comics, horror, tabletop games, don't miss out. June is also headlined by the legendary Jim Starlin and the release of an omnibus for his classic series Breed, as well as Babylon 5's Claudia Christian's new release, Dark Legacies. If you ever wanted to own a piece of Zoop, now you can. They're wrapping up an equity crowdfunding campaign where your contribution earns you shares in the company, as well as other perks. Visit republic.com/Zoop to become an investor in Zoop. For creators looking to crowdfund your project or have your books for sale in Zoop's brand new e-commerce marketplace, email them at hello@wearezoop.com. And now, back to the show. The thing that I really appreciate about it is it's the one comic that I can be certain of that I don't know what's coming.
I hope we continue to keep that up.
Sometimes I hope that, and sometimes I don't. You very much surprise me constantly. Like the end of number 10, I was just like, what the fuck are you guys doing to me right now? It's mean that you just did an evil laugh a little bit there.
I've got a few evil laughs in me.
I like it. I do think that's one of the things that you always capitalize really well on, though, is the power of surprise. Because it's like, Something is Killing the Children. It's like when you start reading that, you don't know it's an Erica Slaughter book until you reach, the end of first issue?
Yeah.
And then it's like Department of Truth. You finish the first issue. What's the last thing you learn about? Lee Harvey Oswald. And then spoilers for the first issue of Department of Truth. Apologies. I probably should have said that afterwards. Nice House. Nice House is obvious. I mean, it's like the world is ending and like your best friend is an alien. And so there's all these things that you do in these books. And it's funny because those are the hooks, right? Those are the things that really like, you're like, okay, so I'm in because I know this now. But it's funny with World Tree because it's like, you just never stop with the surprises. And it really works because that, in a great way. It's not like you're trying to M. Night Shyamalan us or something, but it totally works.
Well, and I mean, it's a big story with a lot of complicated pieces. So there are lots of layers to pull back. And then, I don't know, it's the joy of making it. I want to lean into, it's just like, oh man, what if we do this? And then suddenly I'm like messaging Fernando and just being like, okay, I have a crazy idea. And that means like throwing out one thing we were planning to do like 5-10 issues later and like bringing another thing from that like way up in the story. And I love those moments. That's the joy of making comics to me.
I don't want to say the character's name because it would be a spoiler still, but I do love that you killed my favorite character and somehow he's been in the book as much as before.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, and he that I think that is part of the core conceit of what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, and also I do have to shout out your artist. It helps tie this all together that you have such amazing artists working with you. You got, Martin Simmons, you mentioned, Fernando Blanco's doing incredible stuff. Werther Dell'Edera always killing it. And then, I mean, I feel bad for Alvaro. He's like, he's gonna have to design a new nice house. Was he mad? Excited?
Oh, he was very excited. And it was one of those things. So it's like, it's the nice house by the sea. And in my original like versions of it, I was picturing something very tropical and Caribbean, but he's in Spain. And so he was just like, what if we do a kind of like Mediterranean villa? And it was just like, then he started sending over pictures and it was like, okay, yes, that's exactly what we're doing. And I'm really excited for people to see what we're doing here. I don't know. You were saying that it's just like World Tree's the one where like there's a bunch of twists, but I think Nice House is where I started getting a little twisty.
I don't even mean twists. I mean like character surprises, like just like relationships and stuff like that. But yes, you're right. I mean, that was where it really hit. I did want to ask about that. That was another thing that I was asked as your PR representative why he would do that, because it isn't Nice House on the Lake Volume 2, continuing that story, is going to be Nice House by the Sea, a new story with new characters and new locations, slightly tweaked circumstances. Was that always the plan, or was that something that happened in the development of whatever came next?
I think people have to read the first issue before I can even begin to answer that question.
Well, that's not useful, James. Damn.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, all I'm saying is that I've been very upfront about the fact that, like, Nice House on the Lake is, like, one of the most personal comics that I've ever written. And I'm not going to take the most personal comic I've ever written and make it not that. And I'm also saying that it's like when we originally, like, pushed Nice House on the Lake, like, #1 out the door, we were basically, like, I think people thought that was going to be a slasher book. We did not reveal, like, what the high concept of the story was until people actually, like, read the book.
Did people tell you that?
I mean, it was just like, but that's how we were positioning it. We were not, like, revealing, like, what this sort of story was and, like, what it meant and all that stuff. The high concept people got to in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But then there is an element where I wanted to explore this from a different angle. Where it is just the fact that it's like, okay, with the Nice House on the Lake, with Walter, you see, like, this alien figure pull together all of his friends, and then you learn that he wasn't supposed to pull together all of his friends. He was supposed to pull together 10 of the most exceptional human beings that exist to be the last 10 humans that exist.
Right.
And then you learn the idea that there are these other cells out there, different sample sets of the human population. And so I wanted to show a house where somebody actually, like, the collector figure did it correctly. And you actually have 10 of the most exceptional humans in their fields, except they don't like each other. And they all have to, like, live together in this space. Like, and so suddenly you see what Walter did from a completely different angle, where it's just like, did Walter actually build a more stable set than what the actual, like, alien intent was? And it's like, those are the sorts of questions that I want people asking. But it, like, it changes the stakes in terms of how these people were informed of what they were going to be a part of, and how they relate to each other. And then it also, like, how far they're willing to push the science fiction limits of this space and the ways that they can modify their own bodies and all of this bizarre stuff that I'm able to go into in, like, way more science fiction-y ways. But at the heart of it, this is a very deeply human, very deeply personal story.
Yeah.
And I think people who loved the first year, like, should read the first issue.
I suspect that they will. I do think it's funny for a person who said you should just read the first issue. You just gave a very good sales pitch for the next volume, because I think the thing that's interesting to me about it is the sociological experiment of it, where it's like, it's kind of like apocalyptic Lord of the Flies times Big Brother in a weird way. And it's like, what are these crazy roommates going to do today? It's like, well, these guys like each other, and these guys all think they're pieces of shit, and they're all exceptional at what they do. And so it creates this, like, there's going to be different relationship arithmetic that goes in with all this stuff. And I think that stuff is the really fascinating things. We can't go in further in that because obviously read the first issue, but I just have a few more questions. I did want to ask about the Kickstarter in particular, because you just did the Kickstarter for James Tynion IV, the first decade at Boom Studios. It ended this week. It nearly reached $270,000 from just under 1,600 backers. I don't want to talk about the origins of that. What I do want to know is, do you feel like you learned anything from that? Because that is a very specific project that allows you to kind of see how the kind of collectors and the people who are really into your stuff behave. Was there anything that you took away from that experience?
Yes, and I'm trying to decide how many of those things I want to say out loud.
Sure.
I mean, it's incredibly gratifying. Like, this is, like, for a campaign, like, these are two of my older properties. The Woods and Memetic are books that I am deeply, deeply, deeply proud of. They are the books that I think have the entire, the blueprints and genesis of all of the works that follow. You can see Nice House on the Lake in The Woods, like, in so many different ways. You can see, like, World Tree and Memetic in very, very clear, direct ways. Like, these are the themes that I've been fascinated with since my, like, early 20s. When I started writing those books. And so getting to, like, reintroduce those properties to my current reader base has been a priority of mine for years, and something that I was like very much like, hey, boom, when are we going to do this? And then it's just like, okay, 10 years, like that feels like the moment to do it. And then obviously being able to like wrap it up with a little bit of the 5th anniversary of Something is Killing the Children, like that gives a little spice to the whole thing. It's a reprint project, and it's a reprint project to books that, this isn't even like, James Tynion, writer of Detective Comics. This is like James Tynion, writer of Talent. There was like that and Batman Eternal, where I was like part of the whole team there. These were coming out when I wouldn't have even like, I wouldn't even call myself like a B tier comic creator during that moment. Like this was the very start of my career. So it's just like, it's an experiment. It was me trying, it's like, okay, how do we like, create an event out of bringing back some older ideas that I'm still quite fond of.
Yeah.
And to that end, like I learned a lot. And, but I mean, it's also one of those things where these are projects that are like, when it was very like fascinating, just sort of working that process through with Boom, who's done a lot of these sorts of campaigns, and like we were right on the heels of like same as last time. The Woods came out 1 month after Lumberjanes, and there was a Lumberjanes campaign like 1 month before this one.
Yeah.
Also for the 10-year. And, it's just sort of, it's fascinating to sort of see these different lanes. And I think that, I am very interested in the direct to consumer space and crowdfunding in particular. And I think that, I think my other big foray into that is room service, which just fulfilled this last month with the comic shipping out. And
I have mine upstairs.
Oh boy, oh boy.
Oh boy, oh boy.
And the short film going out to all the backers. And I like crowdfunding as an experimental space. And this still fulfilled those terms to me, because this was like going back and reprinting work that like we needed to show the audience for these projects. And then now there will be like a book market edition of these books, like, that'll come out in the fall. And will sit great on the shelf next to the deluxe edition of Something is Killing the Children. And then, what matters to me is the book that ends up on the shelf. And it's been fascinating, like seeing, how to tap into that audience. And it's always fascinating to see these projects that people connect to.
I do think there's two really interesting things from all that. One is that it goes back to the idea of you have all these books, like how do people discover them? And like the idea of Something is Killing the Children being like almost a discoverability tool for The Woods and Memetic is a really interesting one, because you can see how much the audience of the biggest book will draw over to the other books, and how much like that rising tide will lift all ships. So there's that. But then there's the other thing where I actually think that we're in a moment where I think people in comics are starting to realize that crowdfunding can be used in different ways beyond just like, it doesn't have to just be a reprint project. It can be something new. Like this week, Kieran Gillen and Jamie McKelvey and Katie West announced The Wicked and the Divine, the covers, which is a project they're going to be kickstarting where they just do a coffee table book of their covers. And I think that's great. I think that's really smart, because that is something that already exists as covers for their books, but it doesn't exist as a standalone project. And so like, how do you turn old work into something new, whether it's like art books or it's like something like that cover book, things like that. And I think we're just scratching the surface of the way creators can use crowdfunding. And it's going to be really interesting to see how people use that in the coming years. And I imagine you have thoughts on that you cannot share.
I sure do. But I mean, but I think it comes down to the same thing that I was just hitting on, is that I think it's an interesting, it is a very interesting lane to pursue things that require an interesting lane that is more about like leaning directly into your core base of like readers. And, and I think it's most exciting when it feels like an experiment or like an activation of, like a core fan base. I think art books have been, in the comic space, that's the thing that makes the most sense, because these are things, art books like tend to be like short print runs and stuff like that, but you can build up a lot of excitement, and then you release a beautiful like hardcover edition that's like fully paid for, because hardcovers are expensive. They're really, really, really expensive, and they take a really, really long time to make.
Yeah.
So like that's part of why crowdfunding is really useful, for hardcovers, because otherwise you have to like decide the print run on a thing that you don't know how many you're going to sell. It's something that, like is huge impact on profitability on things and all of that. It's just like if you make a wrong decision early in that process, it can really bite you for a really long time. And I've seen that happen to like friends, and I've tried to navigate that before. So it's just like, okay, like I think that that's a great lane for it. I think there are other experiments that it's a great lane for too. And I think but I think part of it is about that prestige printing element, is that like, what is something that is more difficult to do through the direct market, or like a lot riskier to do through that lane. And then it's just basically it covers the base costs. And then, and I think the best iterations of this always have the version of it that then is available in the direct market. So it's just like you get the best of both worlds, but you get to offset that initial gamble in a big way.
It's underwriting and proof of concept all in one package. Just two more questions. One, this is a completely random aside, but I had to ask because I saw it in the Zero issue announcement for Something is Killing the Children. Is Eric still editing Something is Killing the Children, even though he's at Tiny Onion now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Eric is still editing the whole Slaughterverse line, and there are a handful of other projects that, he was overseeing at Boom. We still have a really good relationship with Boom.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, Tiny Onion provided design services for the Art of Something is Killing the Children art book that was part of the Kickstarter campaign. So It's just like, on top of everything else, like Boom, hires us to do some stuff sometimes. And we're talking about other projects in that lane because we like designing books.
Yeah.
Making them look real pretty. So, that's, I've been extremely grateful that, it's one of those things where I think everyone always expects these moves to be a lot more dramatic than they end up being. And there's always a little bit of drama. But I mean, it's down to the fact that, back when I quit Batman, and I quit Batman.
Oh, yeah. You had a whole post about that.
Yeah. But a month later, they reached out to me to see if I wanted to do Sandman comics, and I did them. And then Nice House is coming out this summer from DC. I go to the theater with, my good friend who's a DC editor. This is industry built on long-term relationships. And, I've always been independently minded, and the people who've worked with me have always known that. And even before I had a company, I kind of operated as if I did. So I mean, it's been really nice to be able to maintain and build on those relationships, because, I'm not looking to, push anybody down or ruffle feathers or anything, but it's just like, I have a certain way that I see how I want to do things. And, it would be one thing if I had learned over the last few years that it's just like going into these multiple lanes was sort of cannibalizing an audience from one to the other, but I haven't learned that. Having these different lanes, cooking simultaneously is has always proved to be a benefit to me. And, and the books still sell really well. I think they do well for shops. And so I'm going to keep going.
Yeah. I like how Tiny Onion is just kind of seeping its way out into things and no one knows it. It's very good. I like it. All right, last question. This might be tough to say. We're only halfway through 2024, but I'm asking anyways. If 2024 is about returns of old favorites, what is next year about for you?
This year is the returns of my classics. I was having this conversation earlier in the week where it's just I feel like over the last 3 years in particular, it's I set up an entire row of dominoes. And then it's just I've spent this year knocking them down one by one. All of the things that I've sort of laid the groundwork that I knew I needed a company in order to do, but it's just now I'm going and actually doing that. And so part of next year will be execution. I actually have to then carry all of those projects forward. But it's also the year that you're going to start seeing the first moves of Tiny Onion as an entity and the new projects that emerge from that. I didn't start a company not to have a really big launch that I want to take the direct market by fire. So it's just if this year is reminding all of the retailers, the strength of my books in from the past and, reassuring them that they're sticking around. Next year is when I'm going to be going to retailers and asking them, it's just all right, and here's the next big one.
Yeah. How far out are you thinking normally?
We did a publishing plan at a Tiny Onion Summit a few weeks ago, and the last book that we have a rough estimate of when it would come out is in 2032.
No. I thought I was going to be outlandish by suggesting 2026. In my head, I was like, I bet he's in the first quarter of 2026. That sounds like a sci-fi number, James. No.
I mean, I hope the world's still around by then. Like, we're going to find out.
Fingers crossed. Wow. Okay. Well, I feel like that's a good place to finish. I also hope the world is still around then. But James, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about everything you have cooking over at Tiny Onion. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for talking. It's always good to see you.
Always good to see you too. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer James Tynion IV. You can find him on social media and his work in the Returning the Department of Truth, the upcoming The Nice House by the Sea, and much more. Big thanks to Deanna Chapman for stepping in to edit this episode. If it sounds better than usual, it's because of her. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast, as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my Eisner-nominated subscription comic site, Sketched, at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at @sketchcomic or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including David Wilson, Joe, Benjamin Wilkins, Chris Hacker, John Neesmith, John Auerbach, Dustin Weaver, Ninja Assassin Love Story webcomic, Brandon Heyman, Aiden Hammond, Kenny Myers, Faith Aaron Hicks, Ah Yeah Comics, Ben Rowe, Cameron Brown, Jonathan Breen, Danny Ollie, Charlie Stickney, Tom Drennan, Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosherd, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Scott Place, Travis Gibb, Darcy Van Polgees, Travis Schmeiser, Tom Evans, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian Hole, Near Levy, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Jingo Boren, James Tynion IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Domstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Vandeven, Submit Industries, Jack Bull Queen, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon Pills, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Leona Kingus, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Creta, Stefan Hull, Philip Myra, Chris Pachala, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Ranwan, Vita Yala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Jason Assey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Brawley, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendrick, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Adam Heifel, Fiona Staples, Mark Abbott, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics Star in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out both their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.